You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Alexa Plus. Say hello to Alexa Plus and see how Alexa can do more for you. Need tickets to that last-minute show? Craving your favorite restaurant? Sit back, relax, and talk naturally. Alexa's on it. Alexa learns your preferences to create a personalized experience. And now, Alexa Plus is free with Prime on your Amazon devices, like Echo and Fire TV. Learn more at amazon.com/Alexa Plus.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. This man has no bones in his body. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl. So, we have been delving into the history of the Goths this season, and Jen is now very, very sorry that she asked me to triangulate the Goths, I'm sure.
Yes, very much so.
You now have a sense of who the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths were, as well as who the Tervingi and the Grithungi were. The Goths tend to get presented in dualities a lot, so Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Tervingi, and Grithungi. And there's one more duality that we have not delved into yet, the Amali and the Balthi. These were two noble Gothic family lines, as described by Jordanes. The Balthi were Alaric's family, allegedly. They were Visigothic and Tervingi, and the Amali were their Ostrogothic counterparts. They were this royal family line that was a Grithungi family line and also Ostrogothic. The story of the Amali, as told by Jordanes, may be the story of a real Gothic royal family, but it may also be an act of imperial myth-making to burnish the image of a king named Theodoric the Great. Theodoric was an Ostrogoth, a member of the Grithungi tribe and the Amali royal line, and perhaps as prominent to the Ostrogoths as Alaric was to the Visigoths, because while Alaric sacked Rome, he couldn't hold it. He didn't even try to hold it. Theodoric did hold it and rule it, and this is his story.
After Attila died, possibly at the hand of Ildiko, the fanfiction Valkyrie that we all now know and love, Attila's kingdom dissolved into infighting. Shocker, I've never seen that happen before in history. Attila's sons fled or were slain in battle, and eventually the three Amal brothers, Valimir, Vidimir, and Theodomir, fought off all contenders and came to rule over a large coalition. It was around this time, around 453 AD, that this alliance of Goths, Huns, Alans, Sarmatians, and others who had won their independence from the Huns started cropping up in the ancient Roman sources as the Ostrogoths. One of those brothers, Theodomir, was Theodoric's dad.
Before we move on, I just have to get something off my chest.
Oh, please unburden those titties.
I'm gonna unburden my tits about something. So, I really feel like it's important to note that neither the Visigoths nor the Ostrogoths were uniformly white Germanic peoples at this point. The Ostrogoths have been under Hunnic domination for 75 years, right? They are culturally Hunnic by now, and by the time they get out of that rule, they also have Hunnic allies, and they have these other peoples, the Sarmatians, the Alans. The Alans show up a lot in these sources, and they were basically Iranian horse archers. This is like a multi-ethnic, multicultural coalition, and really the same thing is true with the Visigoths. Like, you saw the Visigoths allying with these Alanic and Hunnic mercenaries during that Gothic war that we covered. And they became culturally Hunnic too. And you don't see it as much in the sources, but you notice it in certain little clues. Like, for example, Jen, do you remember the Battle of the Willows when the Goths had to wait around for their cavalry friends to get back from fucking Thracian Starbucks or wherever they were to fight this battle with the Romans?
Yeah, vaguely.
Okay, well, that happened. This was like a few decades prior to Alaric's sacking of Rome, and then in 410 AD, when Alaric sacked Rome, like around that time, you have like Ataulf, Alaric's right-hand man, riding down Roman legions and attacking them using lassos. And the lasso is a Hunnic weapon, right? They were already culturally Hunnic by then. It's just like a few decades after that. Like they're using Hunnic weapons and no doubt adopted Hunnic cavalry tactics, and they have a lot of these people in their coalition. So these are not all white people. This is kind of a narrative that I feel like white supremacists push, is that the Goths were all like a bunch of Germanic white people, and that is not the case, especially later on in the history when we're talking about Ostrogoths and Visigoths.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just so important to keep like hammering that point home, because it's really easy to think of like the Goths as being sort of one group or two groups, that duality that Jenny talks about that they get lumped into a lot, but that isn't actually in reality who these people were or how they would have been broken up ethnically.
Right, not ethnically and not culturally. So anyway, now that I've gotten that off my tits, I can move on.
Do they feel better now?
They can breathe a little better, yeah. So, back to this story about Theodoric the Great, right? Theodoric is a baby at this point. Theodoric was born about a year after the Ostrogoths gained their independence from the Huns, and that would have been in 454 AD, just as his dad and his two uncles were still solidifying their kingdom, or their control over their coalition. Theodemir, as we said, was his dad. His mom was Euryluva, but she was later baptized Catholic and took a new name, Eusebia. She was a devout Catholic Christian, and Theodoric was an Arian Christian, as most of the Goths were by this point. And I'll go into what the difference was in a future episode that focuses more on the Christianity. Eusebia is sometimes called a concubine of Theodemir, implying that they weren't married, but this may have been a reference to the fact that even though they were both Christians, society or their culture at this time would have seen them as a mixed religion couple because one was Arian and one was Catholic, and thus they would have seen their marriage as invalid.
True fact.
Catholics can only marry other Catholics. It's known.
That's not untrue, actually. Like, for a long time, if you weren't Catholic, you kind of had to promise that you would raise your children Catholic if you wanted to get married in a Catholic church. Like, there's a lot we could talk about that, but maybe not today.
I thought you couldn't get married in a Catholic church unless both parties were Catholic. Is that the case?
Probably not anymore, but it was.
Yeah. Anyway, so Theodemir and Eusebia had two children, and their names were Theodoric, as we said, and a girl, Amalafrida. Notice the Amal name in her first name. This repeats with a lot of the women in this line, and we'll get to that too. For a while, Theodemir ruled the Ostrogoths with his two brothers, but in 465 AD, Valamir was thrown from his horse in a battle and killed, and a few years later, Vidimir went to Italy on some mission. Records of this are a bit confusing, but he died there.
Theodemir and his brothers may have thrown off the Hunnic yoke, but they were still kings without a kingdom, and they had sworn never again to be ruled by the Huns. That meant they had to deal with a lot of stronger powers to negotiate their safety, and one of those was the Roman Empire. I mean, yeah, it's still a player at this point.
It is, yeah, mostly the Eastern Roman Empire, but the Western Roman Empire was still around at this point.
So in 461 AD, Theodemir negotiated a treaty with Leo I, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire at the time, that required he surrender a royal hostage. And that turned out to be Theodoric. He was about 7 or 8 by now, maybe. Or maybe he was 11. I'm 11!
Actually, it is contested. Like, there are some historians that suggest he was maybe 5 or so years older than the numbers suggest here.
Theodoric was sent to Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, where he was treated as a member of the imperial family. For the next 8 years, until he was about 15 or 16, Theodoric was educated by the best royal tutors of Rome. Introduced to Roman culture and customs, he cultivated Romanitas.
Romanitas.
He learned to hang with the Roman aristocracy as one of them. And apparently, he was highly favored by Leo I. He called him Uncle Leo. I mean, Uncle Leo and Baby Theo.
I'm sure Uncle Leo took him out for gelato a lot, and they joked about their rhyming names. It would have been real cute, okay?
Exactly. And yes, we know they didn't have gelato, then you don't have to add us.
Look, this is all fan fiction. So you have to add a little personal detail sometimes. So, however, the sources claim that when Theodoric was roughly 15 or 16, he was sent back home with gifts from Leo I. He then assumed leadership over a faction of Goths and won a war against the Sarmatians, cementing his ruling position. And this is why some sources challenge the idea that he could have been this young and done all this, because that's kind of a lot for like a 15-year-old to do. Some sources, Herwig Wolfram, for example, thinks he might have been like 18 or early 20s by now, and was actually born potentially 5 years earlier than the traditional date given. He was either super precocious or he was older than we think. Anyway, this was a great way for Theodoric to introduce himself to his new people as 100% unquestionably a traditional Gothic king. And he would have had to do that because he's just coming back from Constantinople where he got all this, like walking around in a toga, learning Latin, like getting all this like Roman education to be accepted by his people, who probably did not think that highly of the Romans at this point. He would have also had to be able to speak their ruling language. Remember, it was important in Germanic culture, this goes all the way back to Tacitus and the Wildbark culture, for young men to prove themselves by leading raids and winning battles. Tacitus even tells us that if their current community was not sufficiently warlike, young men would strike out and find more violent communities to prove themselves in. So, as a young man, Theodoric ruled jointly with his father, Theodemir. But this arrangement didn't last long. Theodemir died 4 or 5 years later in 475 AD, and by this time, I think both his uncles Valamir and Vidimir were also dead. So Theodoric was left to rule the Ostrogoths at roughly the age of 20 or 25, depending on which version of the story you believe.
So the Ostrogoths were not the only Goths. Over in Gaul, the Visigoths were still active. These people, Alaric's followers, had been given land in Aquitaine, where they would establish the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Toulouse. Confusingly, they also had a king named Theodoric, Theodoric I, who died the year of Theodoric the Great's birth in 451. In the time of Hunnic dominion, several Grithungi kings, alone or with small retinues, had fled and sought refuge with the Visigoths. And there were the Thracian Goths, a group of Tervingi who settled in Moesia.
The Visigoths, as I've said before, were not just the Tervingi. There were also Grithungi with them, some of which who had joined them much earlier, and some of which had joined them around the time of Hunnic dominion. There were also other groups of Goths around, for example, the Thracian Goths, who were about to become important.
The Thracian Goths were a group of Tervingi who settled in Moesia under a treaty with Roman Emperor Theodosius I in 382 AD. In Theodoric the Great's time, Jenny, I'm not calling him Theodoric the Great, and I'm not going to call him Theodoric. I'm going to call him Theo or Baby Theo, because that makes it easier for me. Just remember, every time I'm saying that, I mean Theodoric the Great.
I also call him Theodoric the Amal, because that's what the sources call him before he becomes Theodoric the Great, because that's his last name.
I'm just going to call him Theo. I feel like I know so much about him, I get to give him his little, nickname, so we're fine. So, in Theo's time, the leader of the Thracian Goths was another Theodoric, Theodoric Strabo, or Theodoric the Squinter, who I'm now going to call the Squinter, because why not?
Just the Squinter. He really does need reading glasses, and he does not get them at all at any point.
Or maybe he's what is it, nearsighted, farsighted? He needs ones for distance. Or bifocals.
They don't mention in the sources whether he's nearsighted or farsighted, or whether he has astigmatism. They're historical mysteries. By the way, did you know that Strabo meant the Squinter?
I did now, yeah.
There's other Strabos we run into in the history, and I had no idea that meant Squinter. Mind blown.
Me either. So, the Squinter had serious beef with the Roman Empire, starting with Uncle Leo. And because there are so many Theodorics right now, and as we said, Theodoric is not the Great yet, I'm going to call him Theo or Baby Theo. Jenny might call him Theodoric the Amal. It's all the same person.
Or Theo the Amal. We might go with that. Like I said, the Squinter, the head of the Thracian Goths, really needed some bifocals, had a lot of issues with the Roman emperors. It started when Leo I, Uncle Leo, had ordered a friend of his killed by palace eunuchs and then denied him a promotion. They did not have a friendly relationship.
No, that sounds quite adversarial to me.
I think the Squinter was more upset about the promotion, but I'm not sure. The role in question was Magister Militum, which was the same position that Alaric wanted, and it just made me think, what is this about Magister Militum? I know that this was the head general or a head general in the Roman army proper, it was a very important position. But I'm just why is that the one job title that all of these Gothic leaders are going for?
I suspect it had quite a lot of honor and respect, or was something that their own people could understand, as a huge title, almost like a king title to their people. They got the relevance of it within the Roman army. So it made a massive difference. Also, I've told you many times, very hierarchical systems, they really do breed this sort of contention and need to sort of step on top of to get to the next rung. I get it. I don't like it. But, none of these people at this point in time are being outside cats yet. When they become outside cats, they mess the world up.
It's just super interesting that there's more than one guy. Alaric is just one of several who needs to be affirmed by the Roman Empire in getting this one specific title. And I really suspect there's something about that title that isn't being transmitted down in the ancient sources that would explain it, and we can guess at it, which I think Jen's got some good guesses there, but we don't know for sure. So eventually the Squinter did get appointed Magister Militum, but various fallouts and revolts continued until Uncle Leo died, and the new emperor, a guy named Zeno, who had once been one of Uncle Leo's generals, requested our baby Theo, Theodoric the Amal, the newly crowned king of the Ostrogoths, to come and deal with the Squinter. Could you just deal with this guy, please?
If you give him glasses, things might get easier.
Well, nobody did that, so there was no thought to maybe improving the Squinter's healthcare vision plan.
Shocker, sounds familiar.
Right, exactly. Theo the Amal was a king without a kingdom. His only recourse here at this point after he became king of the Ostrogoths was sacking and plundering and burning the countryside, which frequently occurred within the borders of Rome because they had all the best shit. So he had a problematic relationship with Rome as well at that point. But right now, for whatever reason, Zeno saw him as maybe someone he could use. If he pitted the two Theodorics against each other, maybe they just cancel each other out and stop sacking his countryside. I think that was the hope.
Yeah, that sounds like an epically great plan. So baby Theo agreed to take this job from Zeno. I mean, even all of these names are so silly in rhyme, it's so silly. So, baby Theo agreed to take this job from Zeno and found out quickly why the Squinter was always having issues with him. Zeno was not to be trusted. He promised Theo that he'd send a large Roman force to help him fight the Squinter. But what actually happened was that Theo rocked up to Thrace to find the Squinter there with his army and no Roman allies to be seen. And the Squinter was like, hey girl, clearly this guy Zeno cannot be trusted. Look what he pulled with his promises of reinforcement. He is a total snake. I'm giving you the tea.
I don't want to insult snakes here, but yes, I agree.
And baby Theo was like, I know, right? Like, what? And the two decided to issue a joint request for a peace treaty to Zeno. And Zeno, unsurprisingly, rejected this.
So the following decade or so marked a fraught relationship, shall we say, between both guys named Theodoric and the Roman Empire. Zeno tried continuously to pit these two guys against each other, dangling the title of Magister Militum in front of both of them only to yank it away and offer it to the other one, until they kind of both hated each other as well as Zeno. The Squinter did not prove to be a reliable ally. These two had an adversarial relationship, and in the environment that they were in, it was kind of inevitable. Because they were always being pitted against each other, and sometimes they fell for it and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes there were real stakes, So this one time, when the two Theodorics were at war with each other, the Squinter rode straight into baby Theo's camp in his best armor, his parade armor, his glittering polished armor, and, quote, reminded the Amal and his men that they all had once owned 2 or 3 horses but now had to go on foot like slaves. This is from Herwig Wolfram. These were uncertain times for our guy Theo, the Amal. Uncle Leo was dead, and the guy who replaced him was undependable at best and hostile at worst. Time and again, Zeno let him down, not sending mercenary pay and troops that he promised, not fulfilling his end of treaties, promising titles to Theo the Amal that he withdrew and gave to Theo the Squinter, and vice versa.
See, even though it had been decades since Alaric's sack of Rome, the Ostrogoths still didn't have what they wanted, a homeland. While the Visigoths were settling comfortably into their new kingdom in Toulouse, Theo and his people were still living like pirates, sacking and pillaging and burning, and depending on Rome to appoint them Magister Militum.
They still just needed that affirmation for whatever reason.
They did. They had a really tough time with the Huns, and now they're like, please, Daddy Rome, please affirm me.
Please make us Magister Militum, please.
We just need to be affirmed so we can go on and do the next thing. I get you. Squinter died in 481 AD. It said he was trying to train an unruly horse who threw him off his back and onto a spear sticking out of a wagon. Kind of a weird scene and maybe an ignoble death.
I get the sense from the horse that he deserved it.
So, after the Squinter's death, baby Theo was the last Theodoric standing. He consolidated his power even further, becoming king of all the Goths that he could find. All the ones in the general vicinity.
Pretty much, yeah.
His elevated power meant he was an even bigger problem for Zeno than before. So Zeno gave Theo something he'd been dangling in front of him for years, the title of Magister Militum. He even named him consul, Theo was super psyched and felt so validated and affirmed. It's like, yes, but Theo, validation and affirmation comes from within, not without. Like, that is a losing battle, boy.
He has daddy issues from way back, okay?
And then Zeno said, right, since you work for me now, baby Theo, I'm going to have to ask you to go into Italy and take it back for Rome, for our people.
Now that you're Magister Militum, that means you're my employee, so get used to it.
Get used to it. I want Rome. No, we want Rome. It's our empire. Go take it from me.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
On December 12th, Disney Plus invites you to go behind the scenes with Taylor Swift in an exclusive 6-episode docuseries.
I wanted to give something to the fans that they didn't expect.
The only thing left is to close the book.
The end of an era. And don't miss Taylor Swift, The Eras Tour, the final show, featuring for the first time the Tortured Poets Department. Streaming December 12th, only on Disney Plus.
The Roman Empire did not control the Italian peninsula by now. It was controlled by a usurper named, and I swear to God, every time I look at this word, I'm just like, I do not know how these vowels and consonants work together. So the name is Odoacer, and I've seen it pronounced Odoacer. Odoacer. What I'm asking you, Jen, is do I have to keep saying Odoacer?
I mean, look, this is your baby.
Am I the boss of how we say this? I don't want to be.
You chose to birth a whacker, okay?
I really did. I really made choices here.
I'm dealing with the ramifications of my own choices, so I can't deal with yours.
Okay, so I guess we're just gonna say Odoacer the whole time. I'm sorry. It's probably not the most ridiculous pronunciation that we've ever, Göbekli Tepe, anyone. Anyway, so here's how it happened that there was actually no Western Roman Empire at this moment. Or maybe there was, but it was controlled by non-Romans. Actually, though, that's a question as well. You know what? I can't say anything definitively about this time period, so I'm just going to back up and I'm going to tell you this story. So, we're going 13 years back to 475 AD, when a Roman nobleman named Orestes was appointed Magister Militum by the Western Roman Emperor, who was at this point a guy named Julius Nepos. Orestes immediately, 2 seconds later, turned around and usurped the throne for himself, with help from Gothic federati recruits. So anyway, Nepos fled to Dalmatia, where he continued to insist to anyone who would listen all the time that he was the real Western Roman Emperor until he was assassinated 5 years later just to make him shut up about it. God.
Yeah, that feels like he pulled an Agrippina.
Could you stop talking about this, please? Do you want to live or no?
Can you please stop talking about the death of Germanicus at the dinner table?
Just trying to redirect the conversation to how cute your shoes are one more time, and then I'm going to stop trying. So, immediately after seizing control in 475 AD, Orestes elevated, not himself, but his son Romulus as emperor. He just basically used his kid as a meat shield. It's terrible.
Oh, we haven't seen that at all recently.
No. So anyway, the son's name became Romulus Augustulus, or Little Augustus, since he was 11.
I'm 11!
He might have been like 10 and a half, I'm not sure, but we're going with, he's 11. But Romulus Augustulus was barely more than a figurehead. No edicts or laws were issued in his name. His dad called all the shots. He was a child emperor.
He was, which is very sad.
Their lives do not turn out well.
They really don't. So, This sort of joint rulership lasted about 10 months before Orestes' Federate troops rebelled, led by a general named
Odoacer, Jen, that's how we're saying it.
Led by a general named, as Jenny so delicately put it, Odoacer. Anyway, Odoacer and his troops were pissed that their demands for land grants were refused. They wanted a third of all land in Italy, and they wanted it now.
See, this is what Orestes promised them when they helped him take over. These are the Federati troops who helped him usurp the empire, and he was like, listen, if you help me do this now, I'll give you a third of all the land in Italy. And turns out they really wanted him to do that for them.
Yeah, they wanted him to keep his promise. So when Odoacer and his Federati rebelled, foreign Federati troops stationed in towns all across Italy abandoned their posts and flocked to his banner. Orestes fled to Pavia, but Odoacer besieged it, broke in, and had Orestes executed. His son, Romulus Augustulus, was now alone in the world, hiding in Ravenna, and that's where Odoacer turned his attention. On September 4th, 475, Odoacer captured the city and Romulus Augustulus, who was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to Naples, to the villa of Lucullus, an extremely vast and luxurious estate built in the 100s BC by a guy Pompey used to call, quote, Xerxes in a toga. It was now an imperial fortress.
That villa, I kind of want to do a Patreon on that because it turns out it's really, really interesting. But I didn't want to go on a whole deep dive now because it's a little bit of a digression. So if you Google who the last Roman emperor was, the name that comes up is Romulus Augustulus. But that is a complicated label. See, Romulus Augustulus was only 11. He's 11. You want to say it? I'm
11!
Thank you, Jen. I know it cheers you up. So he was a figurehead. His dad did all the actual ruling. And on the one hand, he was technically a usurper, but on the other hand, it was his dad who was the usurper. So who's the real emperor here? Was it Orestes because he was the one making all the rules? Was it Julius Nepos because he was the last legitimate Roman emperor? Or should we say, I don't know, is it Odoacer? Because usurpers have become emperor before, right? It's not a disqualifying factor as long as you can hold the throne. I know. Odoacer was a quote-unquote barbarian. He was a Federati leader, but these guys were all heavily Romanized, and at one point Odoacer actually served in the Roman army proper. There were lots of guys like this who wound up ruling Rome, men from conquered nations who served in the army, got the Praetorians on their side, usurped the throne, and made themselves emperor. I mean, look at Maximianus Thrax, our buddy.
The huge buff general and also teacup poodle.
That's right, he was a teacup poodle, but he was very buff. Odoacer was just following in a long and time-honored Roman tradition, if you ask me. I mean, what do you think, Jen?
It's like all of these guys were circling the drain of the empire at this point. Like, does it really matter who was last? Like, I'll give it to the 11-year-old who was forced to abdicate and, like, just made into this figurehead because sounds like he deserves it the most.
So it's not clear, by the way, what happened to Romulus Augustulus after he was exiled. He was not executed right away. He does disappear from the sources, though, and most historians think he was dead by about the age of 24.
The point of exile wasn't like a kinder, gentler punishment. A lot of times people were starved or had really bad experiences, but the point of exile above all things was to get the people to forget about you and then to either kill you or just keep you out of the way for the rest of your life. So the idea that he died at 24 tells me he was either sickly or someone was using him to cause trouble. Or he was causing trouble.
I think that they were trying to prevent him from causing trouble, right? Because if he was basically imprisoned, right? He's in a fancy villa, but he's being imprisoned and starved or beaten by his guards or something. He's out of public sight and out of public mind. So people can't, disaffected people who are unsatisfied with Odoacer can't rally around him. I'm not 100% sure if he dies before or after Odoacer, but the next guy who comes into control wouldn't want Romulus Augustulus around to challenge him either. So there's that.
And that's the point. Like, they need to get these highly placed political rivals out of the sight of the common people and maybe out of the popularity, and then they need to do away with them one way or another.
Publicly executing an 11-year-old is not going to particularly help your reputation as an incoming ruler, right? So they had to do what they did with him, which is basically just take him out of sight and then deal with him later.
So from this point on, in 476 AD, Odoacer ruled in Rome. But he didn't just uproot everything and start again. He operated more or less within the Roman system, keeping the Senate intact to give his rule a certain legitimate gloss. This sounds really familiar and I can't think why. Odoacer went around saying that he'd made himself emperor with the approval of the Senate and even under Zeno's orders. Meanwhile, Julius Nepos, Nepo Baby, continued to insist that he was actually still the Western Roman emperor and had been all along. So Zeno, sensing the inevitable, signed and accepted Odoacer as his new imperial colleague. He granted Odoacer the authority to govern Italy in Rome's name. I mean, it's not really like he had a choice at this point. He gave Odoacer the title Dux Italiae. He also urged Odoacer to bring back Nepos from Dalmatia to rule jointly with him. You know, it's the right thing to do, Odoacer. Come on. Odoacer declined that suggestion, but he did mint propaganda coins with both his and Nepos' image on them. He also appointed our lost biographer, Cassiodorus, as his minister of finance.
But Zeno, however we're saying that, Zeno never really liked this guy. And as Odoacer grew stronger in the west, Zeno started worrying that he might try taking over the east as well, which I think is a legitimate fear. Around 489, again 13 years after Odoacer came to power, Zeno got our baby Theodoric the Amal, to go into Italy and do something about that guy. At this point, Zeno was nervous enough about Odoacer that as far as he was concerned, Theodoric could have Italy. He could just have it if he could just get rid of its current ruler. Theodoric went for this deal. In 489, he led his Ostrogoths across the Julian Alps. They fought Odoacer for roughly 4 years until 493 AD, when both sides were so depleted from war that Bishop John of Ravenna stepped in to negotiate a peace treaty where Theodoric and Odoacer were to rule Ravenna jointly as co-kings.
Oh yeah, I see that going so well for them.
Yeah, I can't imagine how that could possibly go wrong.
They both share so good with others and
their daddy issues do not clash at all. And what are you talking about?
Never have any space or boundary issues. Like, they're such good buddies living communally. Like, this is not going to be a problem. They can share power and wealth.
Anyway, that lasted about 10 days. So, the death of Odoacer is kind of epic. Theodoric killed him at dinner, as the Romans once killed Gothic leaders. You know, this was an assassination banquet. And it's also, a really clear example to me of visiting his own cultural trauma on the enemy. Anyway, apparently, Theodoric had plotted to have one of his henchmen kill Odoacer at the banquet so he wouldn't get his hands dirty in between the cocktails and the hors d'oeuvres or whatever. But that fell through. And so Theodoric decided, you know what, fuck it. You want something done right, you gotta do it yourself. I'll just do it myself. Mid-chew, he drew his sword and struck Odoacer on the collarbone and then split him in half down to his thigh. And this is like really common death that I keep seeing come back in the sort of old Germanic epics and Viking sagas and things. People getting split in half, like down the torso. I don't think this is exactly where it comes from because I think it appears in Ammianus Marcellinus too, and that's like earlier, but it goes back real far. I don't know if anybody was ever actually killed this way, because it sounds kind of medically impossible, but what the heck do I know? Anyway, as he was being hacked to death, Odoacer cried, "Where is God?" And Theodoric answered, "This is what you did to my friends." Apparently, he still held a grudge for Odoacer killing a Rugian royal couple that he sometimes unicorned for. Anyway, so Theodoric then stood over Odoacer's steaming corpse and declared, "This man has no bones in his body," which is how he hacked him in half like that, I guess. It's a real weird scene. There's some unfortunate translations going on here, but it's just very strange.
So if you're asking yourself if that was enough bloodshed for baby Theo, the answer here is no. He then set out to exterminate all of Odoacer's friends and family. He had Odoacer's wife, Sunigilda, either stoned to death or starved to death, depending on the source. A group of Gothic archers used his brother, Anulphus, as target practice as he tried to seek refuge in a church. His son, Thela, fled to Gaul, avoiding death initially, but baby Theo had him murdered when he tried to return. And Theo's Goths unleashed a bloodbath on Odoacer's closest Germanic followers. Wolfram tells us that Theodoric spared Odoacer's Roman allies, including his supporters in the Senate, simply confiscating most of their wealth. From then on, in 493, Theodoric was the undisputed ruler of Italy. Everyone was scared shitless of him. The Goths were in charge. They were the new Romans. And Theodoric, the Grithungi, the Amal, the Ostrogoth the Great, baby Theo, was the Western Roman Emperor now. Suck it, bitches.
Gargle my balls.
Ew.
So Theodoric took charge in Ravenna. Ravenna was the capital city right now, and that is a lot farther north than Rome if you look at a map. So Theodoric took charge in Ravenna. He settled his people in northern Italy, threw games in the circus and Roman Colosseum to celebrate, started up the grain dole in Rome again, and established himself as a ruler over both Goths and Romans. And he truly did bridge both worlds. Educated in Constantinople from a young age, among the children of Roman emperors and aristocrats, he nonetheless established himself as early as his teens or 20s as a traditional Gothic ruler. He had both Romanitas and the riz of a Gothic king. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. They walk like a rock star girl.
Right. Look, as soon as I start saying riz, that word is over, but I'm still going to say it.
It's totally over, and that's fine.
Ostensibly, Theodoric was a subordinate of the Roman emperor in the East, ruling on his behalf. He didn't actually have, the title of Augustus or Caesar, which was frequently what the Roman emperor had. But this was an agreement he'd negotiated with Zeno, and Zeno died not long after he came to power. The next Eastern Roman emperor had other concerns and mainly left Theodoric alone to do what he wanted in the West, and let's be real, the turnover was high until we get to Justinian. And anyway, being left alone suited Theodoric just fine.
So Theodoric was a Gothic king. He had been one since, at the earliest, 15. But he was also a Roman aristocrat, steeped in Romanitas.
Romanitas.
And he styled himself as a Roman emperor, stepping into a pre-existing bureaucracy and using it for his own ends. And we've seen some refer to the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy as the, quote, most Romanized of all the Gothic kingdoms.
As far as I know, there's only 2 Gothic kingdoms. So I think that the bar is low on that, but that's what I've seen.
But what do we know?
Clearly nothing. Nothing, Jon Snow.
So, baby Theo would have been insulted to hear people in our time in modern day calling Romulus Augustulus the quote-unquote last Roman emperor. No doubt, he thought he was the last Western Roman emperor himself.
Oh yeah, he would have real thoughts on us calling Romulus Augustulus the last Roman emperor when clearly several other emperors came after him, including himself. He'd be like, listen, I have more Romanitas than he did.
And I have more riz. Look at the whole package. Come on, people.
Could you just look at the whole package and see me for who I am?
Technically, Theodoric was still just a highly placed official operating on the Eastern Roman Emperor's behalf.
But don't tell him that. It's just going to be a whole thing. Do not tell him that.
Don't tell him that. No. He was not a Caesar or an Augustus on paper. He didn't have the title. In practice, however, he had the best of all worlds. He had little supervision from the Eastern Roman Empire, if any. And he adopted a lot of the trappings, including wearing that purple, babe.
Oh yeah, he wore that purple. Purple was his color.
Yeah, and he was known for dropping little pearls of wisdoms like, quote, an able Goth wants to be like a Roman. Only a poor Roman would want to be like a Goth. He's got some real identity issues there.
And it also just kind of reminds me of one of those Pelopidas jokes like, am I working hard or am I hardly working?
Can it be both?
So it's here that I wanted to pause for a second and talk about the Amal family line. We're going to dive into the propaganda of that, you guys. And I'm really excited. This is Theodoric's family line, and I have been talking about how the history of that line is basically an act of propaganda and imperialist myth-making this whole series. And I think it's really important to point this out when I see it. A lot of modern writers kind of take Jourdain's account about the Amals at more or less face value. Some of them don't. To me, this reads like propaganda the same way the Aeneid reads like propaganda. I think it's important for all of us to know what that looks like, especially now given current events. What does it look like when a ruling group, a group in power, hijacks history? What does that look like? The Aeneid is one example, but I've seen some historians suggest that basically everything we know about the Roman kings era is Augustan era propaganda. I don't know how true that is.
It is. No, it's true. That's true. Particularly like the idea that Romulus and Remus are descendant of a Vestal virgin who was, let's say, seduced by Ares, right? Like it all goes back to creating this epic line.
Like it or not, as Jen said, Augustus infects the very foundations of Roman history and what we know about it, and that stuff is carried forward now today. We are still repeating Augustan propaganda, and I will not shut up about it.
If you think that there aren't people who believe that Donald Trump is God-touched, come down to the South and I'll show you some things.
Speaking of Donald Trump, have you noticed how the Trump administration is erasing LGBTQ history, women's history, Black and BIPOC history in favor of only white men?
Women didn't do anything. Queer people didn't do anything.
No, women didn't have jobs.
They haven't done anything to serve this country. It's only white, straight, cisgender dudes.
One very specific thing that I've noticed is the Stonewall Inn National Monument had to remove the T from LGBT. Obviously, the T stands for transgender. Their website now just refers to the LGB movement. The LGB movement. The Stonewall Inn Uprising, which occurred in 1969, was led by trans women. They're also erasing any mention of Black and female soldiers in the military. J.D. Vance is purging the Smithsonian for anything he thinks is DEI. So basically just erasing all the history that isn't just about white, straight, cisgender men.
I mean, yeah, they're renaming like mountains so that they are now aggrandizing once again white men as opposed to indigenous peoples. There's removing any mention of the Tuskegee Airmen or the Tuskegee experiments. There's a lot of stuff that's happening right now that they're really trying to, I guess the best word for it is whitewash and erase, right? There's a lot that's going on, and it's super important that we keep telling you that these things happened and that all of this is our history too, because the reality is if they have their way, they will use AI and everything else to paint a very different view of America, which is astonishing. And that is exactly what Augustus did with the framework of the Aeneid, with the sort of cementing of the founding ancient Roman myths, and what we're seeing happen here with these Gothic stories, right, Jenny?
I mean, it's similar, right? But you have to ask yourself, who is this for? Who is this story for? Like, who is it for? With the Aeneid and with Jordanes in particular, I think what it's for is making one person's right to rule and one person's seizure of power look inevitable and like they're, the scion of this extremely august family that's related to gods. I think in our present time,
this is the beginning of an authoritarian myth-making in service to establishing the historical dominance of white, cisgender, straight men, in general Christian men, across all aspects of society. And it's happening because certain men in this category, in general Trump supporters and Christian fascists, are extremely insecure about how their own cultural dominance is declining. But it's not just that, you can smell the decay, right? Like, I can smell the decay.
You can smell the fear. You can smell it. It's like sweat and corpses every time one of those people appears in public.
Yeah, and the only thing that they have is like this continuous like litany of oppression and divisiveness. Like, as long as they can get us all fighting with each other, then no one's going to see that these guys have no clothes and they're sweaty, like bloated vampiric corpses who are just sucking off of the teat of the American people.
The parasite class, shall we say.
Let's expose them to the sunlight and watch them melt.
I wish it was that easy.
It is kind of that easy. We just got to keep exposing their bloated corpses to the sunlight. And before you say, but wait, there are women in these administrations. There are women who are involved in these things. That's true. There were women who were involved in lots of things throughout time. Doesn't mean that they are not complicit in what's happening here or don't have a hand in it.
Absolutely. And if you delve into all of the entire body of our work, we really document how the patriarchy pits women against each other. So it is to be expected that a larger proportion of women than you would think actually aligns themselves with patriarchal control because they see themselves as being protected under that umbrella. How they earn their place and keep their status is by policing the line of the patriarchy and punishing women who are outside of that line. For example, women who have abortions, women who are queer, women who are trans, women who are childless cat ladies, all of that.
It's about stigmatizing women who haven't lived essentially the quote-unquote trad wife life, whose place has been slightly different. And while I hear you saying, but there are women who work in administrations who have positions of power. They do. There are certain positions.
Look what they have to do to keep that position of power. Look what they have to do. Look who they have to oppress. That's how they keep that position of power, by being the patriarchy's attack dogs.
Exactly. So in these situations, we have to ask ourselves, history for who? As I always say, democracy for who? History for who? Who is this story serving? Who is telling the story? So in the present day, we see the Trump administration erasing queer, BIPOC, and women's history in favor of white, cisgender Christian men who they see as the only people who deserve to have jobs or power or influence or participate in the public square. And in Jourdain's, who does this history serve? It serves the Amals. It serves Theodoric, and it serves the Ostrogothic Kingdom.
I'm going to show my work on that one.
Yeah, show your work on that one, and we're going to step off the soapbox, and we're going to let you also pull on those threads until you see the connection. Get out your corkboard, let's go.
Right, I feel like that meme of that guy with the crazy eyes from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Anytime you're like, how are your episodes going? I'm like, I'm that guy. You regret asking me deeply.
This is Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl, and we're here to tell you about Jenny's scorching historical romantasy based on Alaric of the Visigoths, Enemy of My Dreams. Amanda Boucher, best-selling author of the Kingmaker Chronicle, says, quote, "This book has everything. High-stakes action, grit, ferocity, and blazing passion. Julia and Alaric are colliding storms against a backdrop of the brutal dangers of ancient Rome. They'll do anything to carve their piece out of this treacherous world and not just survive, but rule."
Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
Is there a baby in your life who's about to start solid foods? This can be such a confusing and stressful time. As a mom of 7, I really struggled with spoon feeding my oldest baby. But once I realized that babies can safely feed themselves real, wholesome foods using the principles of baby-led weaning, feeding the rest of my babies became an actually enjoyable experience instead of something that I used to dread. Hi, I'm Katie Ferraro, college nutrition professor and dietitian specializing in baby-led weaning, and I host the Baby-Led Weaning Made Easy podcast. Each week, we cover evidence-based, safe infant feeding practices for parents and caregivers of babies who are 6 to 12 months of age. So, if you're confused by all the conflicting info you hear about starting solid foods, or you want easy, actionable tips on how to safely prep food for your baby, or introduce allergenic foods, or figure out when to drop a milk feed, we cover all that and more, plus interviews with the world's leading feeding experts in 2 new episodes each week. Search Baby-Led Weaning wherever you listen to podcasts, and happy feeding.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, I mean, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
So, Jourdain's is where we get all the information about the Amali and the other important Gothic family line, the Balthi. As far as I know, I haven't found this anywhere else. It might be in stuff that's drawing from Jourdain's, I'm not 100% sure though. He was a highly placed official and secretary of a military leader in an Ostrogothic court ruled over by Amali kings almost a century after they gained independence from the Huns, and he was writing a history of the Goths based on the history written by Cassiodorus about 20 years earlier. Cassiodorus was a Roman, a Christian, and a statesman in the court of Orestes, then Odoacer, then Theodoric the Great. Theodoric was an Ostrogoth from the Amali family, and he was engaged in the act of empire building, creating his own kingdom inside Rome, the Ostrogothic Kingdom.
Cassiodorus would have had reasons to write a history of Goths that positions his boss's family as both the founding family of this new kingdom and inheritors of a long and distinguished royal tradition, to give his rule legitimacy and a mythic sheen. Jourdain's Getica is based on it. In short, we can potentially view Jourdain's entire account, especially the bits about the Amali, as imperialist myth-making. So Jordanes presents this line, the Amali, as one of two great royal Gothic families, and it's the most esteemed one. He streamlines the history, making the rise of Valimir, Vidimir, and Theodemir look inevitable, and like there were no other noble Gothic families they had to fight off to rule over the newly independent Ostrogoths. But he also gives the Amali an ancient history, linked to both gods and heroes, much as Virgil gave Augustus's family line in the Aeneid.
So according to Jordanes, the Goths moved from Skansa, or Scandinavia, to Gothiscanza, or Poland, theoretically, before moving on again, finally settling in a place called Oium or Scythia, which translates to potentially the northern and western shores of the Black Sea and parts of Eastern Europe. Maybe that's disputed. It was here that these powerful ruling families arose, according to Jordanes, the Amali and the Balthi. I have taken great pains in my history to tell you that the categories don't all fall neatly into these duologies, Tervingi, Visigoths, Balthi, and Grithungi, Ostrogoths, Amali. But there's a reason people think they do, and that's because Jordanes just comes out and tells us. He says, quote, "The Visigoths served the family of the Balthi, and the Ostrogoths served the renowned Amali. It wasn't that simple. We do know there were Grithungi among the Visigoths, for instance."
Both the Balthi and the Amali were important, but since both Jordanes and his predecessor Cassiodorus were both in Amali courts, naturally the Amali were just a little bit more august and dignified. Just a little bit.
Just a little bit more important. Not a lot more, just a little more.
Just enough, All
right, Jordanes starts things off with giving us a list of Amali begats. Quote, "Now the first of these heroes, as they themselves relate in their legends, was Gapt, who begat Hulmul, and Hulmul begat August, and August begat him who is called Amal, from whom the name of the Amali comes. This Amal begat Hisarnus. Hisarnus, moreover, begat Ostrogotha, and Ostrogotha begat Humuel, and Humuel likewise begat Athal." It goes on like that for a while. This long list of begats exists for one reason, and one reason only, Jen. To align Theodoric's family history with that of other great men who did great deeds, names that no doubt loomed large in Gothic oral histories and religious traditions of Jordanes' time. For instance, according to Herwig Wolfram's book History of the Goths, Gapt, the founding name in this begat list, has been associated with Got, a Scandinavian god of war, and Hulmul is the name of a Danish founding hero who was also a god.
I'm just going to say something here about this one reason. I totally agree that the main reason that everything is written that way is to essentially align the Goths with this great line of men and kings and a divine right to rule. I also think the begats is a really important literary tradition, particularly around this time, but it goes back even older. We see it repeated so often in the Bible of this person begat this person who begat this person and that person. And again, it's that myth making. It's creating a line of kings. And I think it's really important to call it out here because at this point in time, we know everyone was pretty much being Christianized or Christian. So this literary style with this begatting is also bridging those two cultures together, right? It's giving the Goths divine right to rule through the old gods and now the new.
Absolutely. There's a Christian sheen on this, but it also appears in the Iliad. So it kind of appeals to both audiences. And Jordanes was a Christian, but he would have been in a world where not everybody was Christian, although it kind of seems like it at this point.
Exactly. And that's why, it straddles both. We see this begats and these great men mentioned in Homer and other places, but also it's in the Bible. And I think it's so important that he's marrying the two together to create essentially this more than divine, more than, sumptuously literary right to rule. It's wild. I love it.
For a long time, historians thought that the earliest name in this list of begats that was actually a real person was Ermanaric. He doesn't occur until a few paragraphs down, but there's another one, Ostrogotha, who deserves his own digression. He is older than Ermanaric. Historians did not think he was a real person until a new fragment of Dexippus was discovered, a dispatch from the wreckage of the crisis of the 3rd century, scribbled in haste on the back of a napkin and later washed off by monks who wanted to use the paper for something else. You can still smell the siege smoke on that paper. It's garbled and confused and contradicts later accounts, and it's so old Dexippus is still calling the Goths Scythians. It's like my favorite thing ever. And he mentions Ostrogotha by name.
The simple version of things is that Ostrogotha was a leader of a group of Goths from the Ukraine who invaded Rome during the crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 235 to 285 AD. Accounts of that invasion are chaotic and confused. But the fact that he appears here tells us that Ostrogotha's deeds must have loomed large in Gothic oral history of that time. He was a hero, a great man who did great things, my eyes are stuck in the back of my head, who any imperialist-minded king would do well to say was in his family tree. He's a direct descendant of Venus, the Gothic god of war. And he was, according to Jordanes, an Amal, maybe the first real one.
He was an Amal. He had the same last name as Theodoric. That is a true fact.
Yeah, it's the same with Erminaric. He's the next king whose name is corroborated by other ancient sources, whom historians are reasonably sure was a real person. By now, Erminaric had been dead for 174 years, and Jordanes is here insisting that he was an Amal too. Historians debate whether Ostrogotha and Erminaric were related to each other or to Theodoric.
The only source we have on that is Jordanes.
Everything else has been lost, if it ever existed.
If it existed at all, which it probably didn't, to be honest.
Some believe this list of begats was fabricated. I'm in that camp.
Oh, you think?
And that the Amali weren't actually the most important family of kings until the time of Theodoric, or maybe the time of those 3 brothers, Valamir, Vidomir, and Theodomir. It may be one piece of imperialist myth-making built on another, and it's hard to pick those layers apart.
Right, because the Amal family line story also serves one generation back. Those 3 brothers who were trying to establish their own rule over what was probably quite a contentious alliance of different Gothic factions and Hunnic factions and Alaric factions and, other groups, right? So this would have served them too. I think that by the time we get to Theodoric, he was the one who was really imperialist, in a way that they weren't, or they hadn't quite gotten to yet. So I think the strongest theory is that the Amali were mythologized during the reign of Theodoric the Great by Cassiodorus and later Jordanes as a way to legitimize that rule. To back this up, Peter Heather says, quote, Theodoric the Great had monopolized virtually every Gothic tradition, and thus made it impossible for these traditions to be used by anyone else or any differently after the downfall of the Amali in 540. But elsewhere, Peter Heather suggests that name arose in prominence during the Ostrogoth struggle for independence from the Huns, because it was the family name of those 3 brothers. So it was imperial myth-making from a few decades earlier than Theodoric the Great, is that theory. So this is another quote from Peter Heather, quote, it is very likely that the Ostrogoths were not ruled solely by the Amal family when subject to Hunnic domination. Amal rule over these Goths cannot be pushed back into the 4th century through Erminaric because the family link between him and Theodoric is false. Study of Erminaric's supposed successors in the Getica in Jordanes puts the dynasty's claims into even clearer perspective. Balamber or Valamir's Wars, this is a Hunnic leader that is basically made up and very confused in Jordanes and probably belongs in my long screed of how Jordanes messes up the history, but I'll get to that. Anyway, Balamber or Valamir's Wars and other indications suggest that Amal preeminence originated only with Valamir himself in 450, when a number of smaller independent Gothic groups united under his leadership. It is also clear that other non-Amal ruling families had to be defeated or conciliated before Amal rule was consolidated. The Getica's genealogy and associated statements, which backdate Amal rule into the distant past, are no more than dynastic propaganda attempting to legitimize the Amal's de facto seizure of power. So it's either that name was used for a seizure of power in Theodoric's dad's time or in his own time. That's basically what this is saying.
I think either could be true. I don't feel one is more truer than the other. That's who the Amali were. But Jordanes mentions a second Gothic royal family line as well, the Balthi. The Balthi meant either the bald or the bold, depending on the translation. That was Alaric's family line, and that line continued with the Visigoths and Alaric's descendants. Was this name also being used in imperial myth-making? Did the Balthi only become royal when Alaric became so important as a way to justify his kingship? It's hard to say. No writing has survived from the Ostrogothic Kingdom that does a similar kind of myth-building on behalf of the Balthi. They're only mentioned in Jordanes, which makes it, kind of problematic, right?
Yeah, at least as far as I know, and there might be later sources that mention it that probably got it from there, but I'm not 100% sure. I haven't traced it everywhere, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't appear elsewhere other than Jordanes in terms of independent sources.
When it comes to the Amali, it's easy to see why Cassiodorus and Jordanes would have wanted to polish that name's lineage to prop up the existing regime. It's hard to say what the motive would have been to do something similar with the Balthi, who were, at this point, ruling a different kingdom, a kingdom that was now located in Toulouse.
But I have a theory on this as well.
Of course you do.
Yeah, I'm like that guy in the basement with crazy eyes and a corkboard. That's me.
Do you need to unburden your boobs?
I am going to unburden my tits on this. Yes, thank you. So, some historians have traced an ancient pedigree to the name Balthi using linguistics. For instance, just imagine me with my corkboard and my extremely crazy eyes and my hair. I have not showered in a week. For instance, Herwig Wolfram points out that Pliny the Elder mentions a mysterious island called Basilia, translated as Land of the King, which is also called Baltia, Jen. Were the Balthi originally the Balti or the Balts? Did they come from this island? Was the island Scandinavia? Does this mean the Balthi really were a family lineage preserved from before the Goths migrated out of Skansa? We don't know. Right, exactly. These are all questions historians have asked and been unable to answer, but at least they're asking the questions, okay? Herwig Wolfram also points out naming similarities. If you look at the name Alaric, it follows a similar pattern to earlier Tervingi kings. Alaric from 332 AD, Eoric, who ruled from 347 to 348 AD, and Athanaric from 369 to 381 AD, for example. These were all known Tervingi rulers who existed before Alaric did. They all have similar names, Alaric, Eoric, Athanaric, etc. The Rick part was derived from the Germanic Reichs, which was in itself derived from the Latin word rex, because the Goths didn't have kings per se and needed the Roman word for that. Alaric's name meant something like king of all, and these names could have all been titles, not personal names, but the fact that they were all familiar, Herwig Wolfram uses that to suggest that potentially they were all from the same family line, and that's why they had similar names. It suggests the existence of a family line. That's what he's trying to say. Or it could have been a title and they were not related. ? We don't know. That's the thing about studying all of this, is it's just like, yeah, that's one theory, but it could also be explained by this other extremely plausible theory.
So much fan fiction.
So much of it, and a lot of it is from really well-known historians who are still doing their own very informed and yet fan-fiction-y fan fiction.
If Jordanes had an ulterior motive in propping up and mythologizing the Amali family line, what motive did he have for doing the same for the Balthi line? Jordanes doesn't actually talk about the Balthi much. He talks a lot more about the Amali and how great they were and how many people they subdued. He only mentions the Balthi twice. The bigger picture is that both these names are still kind of a mystery. When we try to ascertain whether these names, Amali and Balthi, existed anywhere earlier than Jordanes, we come up empty. And from Tacitus and other sources, we get the picture that Germanic kingship in general, and Alaric's kingship specifically, were elected positions, which would suggest that, quote, ruling families weren't actually a thing.
But my theory is that the Balthi were the real deal, a real ancient family line that Alaric was already part of.
Yeah, because you are so biased.
I might be. Look, we've all got our lenses, right? The reason I think that is, I'm going to show my work. We get a hint at this in an ancient source where Alaric is pissed off that a general named Gaius, a Goth from a non-royal family, was promoted ahead of him in the Roman army. He notably said that Gaius had no lineage, which suggests that Alaric did have lineage. He was pissed that somebody was being promoted ahead of him, like who he outranked in his own system, right? So there was clearly an ancient lineage that Alaric saw himself as part of and Gaius as not part of. So among Jordanes' audience, my theory goes that everybody would have known who the Balthi were. They would have known who Alaric was. He was a great man who did great deeds. He sacked Rome after 1,000 years of Rome not being sacked. He was the guy who brought it down. They knew the Balthi. They liked the Balthi. They liked Alaric. He was a great ruler. He did some great deeds. They'd have heard about the great sack of Rome. Jordanes was borrowing Alaric's glory to burnish up the Amali by suggesting that while the Balthi, whom everyone had heard of, were so great, the Amali were just a little bit older, and they were just a little bit greater. Like, you've all heard of the Balthi, right? Like, the Amali were just a little bit more important than them. That's what I think he's doing here. Basically using the Balthi to boost up the Amali. Does that sound plausible, Jen?
It does, I suppose. It was not the strangest theory we've ever had.
Is it more or less plausible to you than Ildiko the fanfiction Valkyrie?
Oh, it's the same as Ildiko the fanfiction Valkyrie, because I have made her canon. I don't care.
Well, I guess I've made the Balthi canon then.
Yeah, just lean into it.
Did you know only 6% of people are getting enough fiber? That's why Quaker created Fiber February, a month-long movement to show your gut a little more love. It's like dry January, only easier and more delicious. Quaker has over 100 delicious options that are a good source of fiber. So go buy Quaker Oats today and join the Fiber February movement for a healthy gut.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
So, it's a question whether the lore of the Amali name arose with Theodoric's dad, Theodomir, and his 3 brothers, or with Theodoric himself. Historians debate this, but without a doubt, the Amali name had a lot of currency in Theodoric's new Ostrogothic Kingdom in Italy. Herwig Wolfram says that as the Goths settled in Italy, there is a question about how Romanized they were and to what extent they had to follow Roman laws. He says, quote, "What remained of the barbarian tradition was pride in being an Amal Goth, which was celebrated in heroic songs, extolling the divine origins of the royal clan. The magnificent splendor of the Amali could influence politics. Within the Roman Empire, Amal blood became the ticket of admission into the nobility, and among the tribes, Theodoric's race was the most noble as long as its charisma worked. It is true that the Gothic king owed this charisma basically to his Amal descent, but without his rise from the chief of a wandering Balkan tribe to envoy of the emperor and lord of Italy, the widely branched family tree, which began with gods and demigods, would have remained dead capital."
The Ostrogoths were now a people very divorced from their own history. The Goths, right? Who the Goths were, because like I said, they'd been Hunnized. And then Theodoric had also been Romanized. A link to an ancient tribal past, like that had currency. So at the Ostrogothic court, there seem to have been both Gothic and Roman traditions in place. Wolfram describes how, if a man was ambitious, he had to start his career early by working in Theodoric's court as a page. From there, he could gain the king's favor and be elevated to a major domus. That's a title. It meant an eminent man of the royal house. Theodoric had an entourage of these men, in the way chieftains of old had entourages of ambitious young warriors. This appears in Tacitus. That's why I'm actually really glad that we went into Tacitus in that much detail because we do see it echoing. The bigger the entourage, just like in Tacitus, the bigger the chieftain's prestige. Wolfram describes this as a Roman-inflected tradition, but to Goths it would have looked like their culture. Again, this goes back to Tacitus, and I think this is one key to Theodoric's success. He was good at embodying both what the Romans expected of an emperor and what Goths expected of a king at the same time. He knew all the dog whistles for both sides, and he integrated his Gothic followers into Rome's bureaucracy at high levels of power and influence while keeping existing structures intact. Wolfram even talks about how the, quote, head of the royal bedchamber was always a Goth, but the team he supervised was made up of eunuchs in the tradition of imperial Rome, for example.
Theodoric had a large group of followers to settle inside the Italian peninsula, and it's difficult to parse how this worked. Remember, the conflict that led to Odoacer's rebellion involved giving large groups of Gothic followers 1/3 of all land in Italy. That seemed to be the deal on the table here, too. Ancient sources like Cassiodorus describe Theodoric as granting his followers 1/3 of all the land in Italy. And you would think this would have been a huge problem for existing Romans living in Italy, who would be expected to give up their homes. However, some historians say that when the sources say land, what they meant was tax revenue, meaning Theodoric gave out tax refunds to his Gothic followers, which would have been paid through the government, and this would not have affected existing Romans in that area very much. Theoretically, who knows? Other theories suggest that northern Italy was emptied out by now because of all the war and general upheaval, and there's a question of how integrated the Goths would have been into existing Roman communities. Like, maybe they were already there and, part of the community anyway, so it didn't matter.
So, some sources suggest that about 40,000 Goths were settled in large blocks around northern Italy specifically, so they wouldn't be scattered across the peninsula. And remember, Theodoric's base was Ravenna. It wasn't Rome. And Ravenna is very far north.
And Ravenna at this time, just to remind you all, is really the capital of the Western Roman Empire, right? We have Rome, but everything is being based administratively and state-wise out of Ravenna. So Rome is really just a legacy of a much older rule.
I'm not sure if the Senate was still based in Rome. It wasn't that it wasn't used, it's just that where the emperor was Ravenna.
Yeah, so Rome is just a legacy of the much older rule. Ravenna is now the capital.
So some sources suggest that about 40,000 Goths were settled in large blocks around northern Italy, specifically so they wouldn't be scattered across the peninsula and they'd be ready to hand if Theodoric needed to enact conscriptions. Other sources claim that the Goths were much more integrated and moved into Roman towns and villages to live side by side with existing inhabitants. The picture here is hard to determine. I've seen it claimed that Theodoric wanted his Ostrogothic kingdom to be an orderly place, obedient to Roman civitas, which I guess means, law-abidingness.
Civitas!
Civitas. But I've also seen it said that while Roman citizens were still subject to Roman law, the Goths in the kingdom, the Ostrogothic Kingdom, were subject to their own laws and were not officially extended Roman citizenship. I fell down a confusing rabbit hole about how divided this country was between Romans and Goths and what rules everybody had to follow. So, here's one theory. It is not the only theory, but it's kind of a conclusion that I pieced together, is that Theodoric's Ostrogothic kingdom was extremely divided between Roman and Gothic peoples, and each followed different laws. The reason for this may not have been institutional. It may have been that despite Theodoric's elaborate myth-building and his image as a strong ruler, he may have struggled to enforce laws outside of Ravenna because that's where the capital was at this time, as we've said.
Wolfram describes a system of sciones, or agents of the king, who served as messengers bearing direct royal orders to communities outside Ravenna. They didn't show up very often, and mainly only when the king needed something from that particular community. There was no law enforcement here, remember. Both Roman and Gothic communities were probably left to police themselves according to the rules they knew and chose to follow. According to Wolfram, quote, "The state of late antiquity and the political system of the gentilitas, or pagan tribe, outside the empire certainly had one element in common. They both posed a constant threat to the individual's liberty. Theodoric's civilitas was often enough preached to deaf ears. The subordination of the Gothic army to Roman territorial law had to compete with the obsolete Gothic customs. The Beligines, an ancient Gothic legal tradition, acts of violence and violation of the law by the powerful could be prevented only occasionally. Even noble Gothic women beat each other until one of them succumbed. The least sign of weakness could mean the loss of economic and legal status of the free man.
I mean, I think that last sentence there is very evocative and kind of an explanation of why we see these honor cultures in Bronze Age societies, right? Like, we have honor cultures in Bronze Age societies where men are like, honor is at stake! Because if they don't maintain, like, the least sign of weakness could result in losing everything you have because other people will just take it. If everyone's scared of you because you will maniacally enforce your own honor, then no one's going to mess with you. That's what it is. You're being your own police state. So while Theodoric styled himself the Great, Theodoric's Ostrogothic Kingdom, like many places, may have been a fairly lawless place just miles outside Ravenna, and in the absence of strong enforcement of Roman law, Gothic populations reverted to Gothic laws. That's the theory. It's not the only theory. Anyway, even in Ravenna, it's not clear how much power Theodoric had to create new laws. Mostly his powers seem to revolve around issuing edicts or clarifications of existing laws. He didn't seem to, want to shake things up too much, you know?
It's really difficult to shake everything up when you've got, when everything is so contentious. Yeah, Augustus did it, but, not everyone's Augustus.
Theodoric did, however, have sole control over the Roman army. His relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire ebbed and flowed. During his reign, Zeno was replaced by Basilicus, then Zeno again, then Anastasius I, then Justin I, and by the time of Justin I, relations were strained, shall we say. It's unclear to me how Theodoric's rule would have changed things for ordinary Romans. Like I said, the Ostrogoths in Theodoric's party were mainly settled in northern Italy, and it does seem like they were at least somewhat separate from the existing Roman population. While they may not have been granted 1/3 of all the land in Italy, they must have been granted some land and property, which may have led to tension between them and existing populations.
However, some historians point out that this area had just been roiled by 5 years of war. It was probably heavily depopulated by now, so it's likely there were empty villas and farms and whole depopulated towns that would have given Theodoric's followers plenty of room to spread out. The city of Rome would have also been heavily depopulated several decades after Alaric's sacking, and we've seen descriptions that the city was crumbling. It had gone from a population of almost 500,000 to only about 25,000. Those 25,000 people were living in a ruin, grass and trees growing up in the streets, small fiefdoms of functioning neighborhoods separated by tangled overgrowth. Only one of the aqueducts was still operational. It was a dystopian mess of people just trying to survive, and those people probably didn't care much who was in charge. So, the Ostrogothic Kingdom lasted for about 60 years. Theodoric reigned for about 33. That's a long-ass time. He faced a lot of conflict, both from the outside. Visigoths, Vandals, and Burgundians were major threats, as well as sometimes allies, as well as from the inside, with the Eastern Roman Empire, the Senate, and religious leaders, including the Pope. There were several popes who rose and fell during Theodoric's reign.
Yeah, because remember that Theodoric was an Arian Christian, but his Roman population was Catholic Christians. So it was like a 50-50 approximately divided society, and everybody felt they should be in charge.
And then you have the popes who will eventually they're rising here to become kingmakers, but they will eventually be the kingmakers.
Right, exactly. The popes are already pretty powerful in this time. I didn't do a huge deep dive into the popes, but they are pretty powerful. Anyway, but Theodoric expanded his kingdom, especially through marriage. He married Audafleda, sister of the powerful Clovis I, king of the Franks, probably soon after coming to power in Italy. They had 3 daughters, whom he married off strategically to Burgundian, Vandalic, and Visigothic kings. Thus, he shored up his alliances with competing kingdoms and insulated himself against military aggression. Theodoric died in 526 AD. And we have an interesting story of how this happened, actually quite a few interesting stories, and I want to tell them all because they're important and they become important later. Our source for this is Procopius, and I love Procopius. He's got all the gossipy details of Theodoric's rule and the rise and fall of the Ostrogoths. He lived from roughly 500 to 565 AD, so he was around when this was happening. He saw this happen. but from afar, as far as I know, he was a Greek historian in the court of the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, and he accompanied the general Belisarius invading Italy sometime after Theodoric died.
Here's how he describes Theodoric's death. The background for that is that Theodoric has this legend built around him about how just he was as a king, never condemning a man without a thorough investigation. He was also an Arian Christian in a time when Christianity was just beginning to figure itself out. But most of his Roman subjects were Catholic Christians by now, and there were some serious rifts between them, and we will talk about the differences in a later episode. So at first, Theodoric promoted religious tolerance in his kingdom. But he got less tolerant as he got older, possibly because the Eastern Roman Empire was becoming notably less tolerant of Arian Christians, especially Gothic ones, or possibly because he's old and sometimes old guys just become fascists anyway.
Possible, that could be the case as well.
So, late in his reign, Theodoric had the Roman Christian philosopher Boethius and his father-in-law, Symmachus, executed.
Yes, Symmachus.
Symmachus, I think it is Symmachus. Symmachus.
No, you just said it right, yes.
And his father-in-law, Symmachus, executed on made-up charges. And he had the very frail Pope John I imprisoned, where he died.
Anyway, so I'm not going to go into a whole deep dive on what happened here. A lot of the time when sources talk about how intolerant Theodoric got in his old age, it has to do with the imprisonment and execution of all these people. Anyhow, Procopius says that shortly after executing Boethius and Symmachus, this happened. Quote, "A few days later, while Theodoric was dining, the servants set before him the head of a great fish." It's so weird. This seemed to Theodoric to be the head of Symmachus, newly slain. Indeed, with its teeth set in its lower lip and its eyes looking at him with a grim and insane stare, it did resemble exceedingly a person threatening him. And, becoming greatly frightened at the extraordinary prodigy and shivering excessively, Theodoric retired running to his own chamber, and bidding them place many covers upon him, remained quiet. But afterwards he disclosed to his physician, Elpidius, all that had happened, and wept for the wrong he had done Symmachus and Boetius. Then, having lamented and grieved exceedingly over the unfortunate occurrence, he died not long afterward. This was the first and last act of injustice which he committed toward his subjects, and the cause of it was that he had not made a thorough investigation, as he was accustomed to do, before passing judgment on the two men. How weird is that?
It's so weird. So it's clear that the execution of Boethius and Symmachus represented a major break from Theodoric's usual due process. I mean, beheaded fish! And it stoked religious tensions in Theodoric's kingdom. The same went for the death of Pope John I, for reasons that had to do with retaliation for the Eastern Roman Empire not granting certain rights and privileges to Arian Christians who converted to Catholicism. And this wasn't the only wild rumor flying about Theodoric's death. Here's a quote from Herwig Wolfram. Quote, "There is the vision of a pious hermit on the island of Lipari." And this is a quote within a quote. Quote, "The king, barefoot, ungirt, and with his hands tied, was thrown into the crater of the neighboring volcano by Pope John and the patrician Symmachus. In other versions, Theodoric is taken off by demonic horses or dies of typhoid fever, brought on by fear and remorse over his misdeeds, the horror of his contemporaries and posterity at the sinful, demonic end of the Amali, bears pre-Christian features and damns his memory far beyond what was warranted by events."
Other accounts say he died of dysentery.
He wasn't thrown into a volcano by a dead pope or carried off by demonic horses? What?
Or he died of seeing a dead fish. I don't know.
All at once.
It's looking at me. I mean, what I love about that paragraph you read, Jen, is that it really reads to me like Catholic fan fiction about what they wish had happened. Like, this is their fantasy about what they want to have happen to this guy. They hated him so much.
Well, you have to remember this is also a time, this is still quite early in the church's, history, and they're still doing their own myth-making. We all act like Catholicism's been around forever. It's a relatively young religion that splintered off of the original sort of Christianity. And this is all part of that myth making and the idea that This emperor who treated, Catholics unfairly had this epic ending of either fish death or being thrown into a volcano or being carried off by demonic horses. Like, that serves a narrative that's going to put Catholicism at the first and foremost place as the centuries wear on.
Who is this history for? In this instance, it's for the Catholics.
And how is the history preserved? What are the sources that are holding it? Are they sources that are like the lives of saints? If they are, there's your bias.
Yeah. So again, other sources say that Theodoric died of dysentery.
And maybe while he had that dysentery and was shitting his brains out, he thought he was in a volcano or was being carried off by demonic horses. I can see that.
I mean, dying of shitting yourself isn't necessarily a more dignified death than being thrown in a volcano. Like, that, you could still say that and have it serve your Catholic narrative, right?
It's worse, I would say. Like, going in a volcano is much better.
I mean, the demonic horse death is still kind of epic.
Right? Unlike Selkies from the underworld.
Right, dragged off by demonic Selkies. He was 72 years old when this happened, by the way, and he had ruled his kingdom for 33 years, so he had a good run.
He had the last laugh, really.
Yeah. Theodoric's kingdom lasted about 27 years after he died, and the person to rule it next was his daughter, Amali. And I am going to tell the story of the women in his family, because those are also really fascinating stories. The women in his family were essential to shoring up and strengthening his empire. They were basically his foreign policy. Like, his foreign policy was marrying off his daughters.
Do you know who else had that foreign policy of using the women in his life to secure his empire and legacy? It would be Augustus. At the beginning, so it is at the end.
I knew you were going to say that. But I was just going to let you say it. Are you shocked? Are you shocked and appalled at how history repeats? Anyway, the woman in Theodoric's family that we know the most about is his daughter Amali, and there are a lot of others too, and we will get to them in the next episode. So that's it for this week. Join us in 2 weeks for the next installment of this extremely Gothic series. In the meantime, you can join us on Instagram, which is where we're most active, Threads, Blue Sky, and most of the other platforms at Ancient History Fangirl.
But not X, because it's a fucking hellscape, and I'll say that forever.
Or go to ancienthistoryfangirl.com for our newsletter. And if you really want to keep up with us, if you don't like it that we're now twice a month, you should definitely sign up for our Patreon because we publish extra episodes, videos, all kinds of extra content. Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to sign up and support the podcast.
Yeah, and it is that support which makes the podcast viable and allows us to keep doing this work. We've said it before, there are ads in our episode. We don't make enough money from those ads to continue doing the work that we're doing. If you want us to keep telling these stories, if you want us to keep being in your ears, then we need your support as patrons.
That's right. Our signups for the Patreon are really down at the moment, and we're trying not to freak out about it, but if you would like to support us and you want us to keep going, now is the time to sign up for our Patreon. We have 2 people to thank. Thank you so much to Tanya Habeck, or Habeck, apologies if I mispronounced that, and William J. Jackson.
Yeah, thank you so much. Once again, you're the reason we can keep the podcast going. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you whenever we see you next. Hey everyone, it's Jen and Jenny here, and we've got a bonus treat for you. We're giving you an excerpt from the audiobook version of Jenny's novel, Enemy of My Dreams, narrated by the fantastic Lisa Flanagan.
So this is a spicy scene, just a heads up. I am dropping exactly one spicy scene in our rotating cast of excerpts from the audiobook, and I love this one because Julia and Alaric's relationship gets sexy without losing that fun antagonism.
That's the joy of enemies to lovers, and this book is definitely enemies to lovers.
They definitely act like mature adults here. I don't know. I love it because these people are clearly obsessed with each other and fighting it, and that's really fun for me. And again, Lisa Flanagan's narration just really brings all this to life, and I just love it so much and felt the need to share it with all of you.
Give this a listen. We hope you enjoy it. And you can pick up the audiobook or a physical copy or an ebook of Enemy of My Dreams wherever books are sold.
Julia paced the guest house furious. Hours had passed, day had faded, and the twins would not let her out. Alaric had put the fear in them. How dare he imprison her here like a dog that had slipped its leash? The message could not be clearer. She was a prisoner, and she must never forget it. At least there was wine. Julia poured herself another cup of the robust red, just as voices rose outside and then the shadows shifted. She turned to see Alaric, framed by the sunset, lifting the door flap, with one superbly muscled arm. "Where have you been?" she demanded. By way of reply, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, silencing her disapproval with his mouth. He crushed her to him, his kiss hot and demanding, and suddenly she'd forgotten her anger entirely. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her throat. "I'd have come earlier if I could." But she no longer cared. She was on fire, melting in his arms, defenseless as he lifted her onto the table. Her legs came up of their own accord, locking around his hips. He pressed her onto her back, his mouth burning a ferocious line to her collarbone. Her hands curled into his hair. "Don't. Stop." But she was shaking with need, and from the wicked laugh in her ear she knew what he had heard. Don't stop. She felt like a candle wick lit aflame. He brought his mouth back up to her lips, kissing her long and deep, and Julia forgot everything else. This was Alaric, fire and war and savagery racing through her blood like fever. It had been so goddamn long. He'd come to her warm from another woman's bed. The thought was cold water on her desire. Dimly she realized he had her up on the table now, her legs thrown wildly around his waist, her skirt hiked up her thighs, her whole body arching up to him as if making an offering of herself. So much for being the one he couldn't have. "Stop! We have—" Her body throbbed and ached and hurt. "We have to talk." It surprised her to no end when he backed off. Julia slid off the table, turning her back to him as she adjusted her clothes, then busied herself pouring a cup of wine. Her hands shook. At her back, an intense, ferocious quiet. She gulped the wine, and when she turned, he was leaning casually against the central pole that held up the roof. Chiseled arms crossed over his magnificently bare chest. When had he lost his shirt? "Well?" He raised a brow. "Talk." Julia drew a breath. For a moment she could not remember words. "If you won't, then I will." Blue eyes glittered in the light from the banked coals. "I will not send you back to your brother. Stay with me, Julia." Julia covered her shock by taking another drawn-out sip of her wine. What was she to make of this? Was he offering Rome in exchange? Had he come from Brisca's bed to say that? Be the one he can't have. "You have nerve," she said lightly. "You assume a great deal. Just because I lay with you once doesn't mean I will again." His eyes dropped significantly to her shaking hands. "Is that so?" Julia tensed. She wished he wouldn't drop his voice to a throaty purr like that. It was entirely unfair, when all he had to do was look at her to make her absolutely stupid with the desire to touch him. The gods help her when he grinned or crossed his arms over his chest or took his shirt off. "Are you prepared to pay my price, King of the Goths?" Julia arched a brow. "You gave Brisca a kingdom for her time in your bed. I want an empire." Alaric's laugh rolled through her, warm and luxurious. Julia's hands clenched around her cup. Would she win this negotiation by throwing it at him? Cleopatra would never. "Julia, not 3 weeks ago you were a vagabond who begged me to take you. You have nothing to offer. No kingdom, no allies, no land. And you think you have the standing to demand an empire of me? For something I can have from any willing woman." His grin flashed on his tanned face. "You're the one with nerve." Rage stopped her breath. "Laugh at me all you wish, but if you want a place in my bed, an empire is my price." "So transactional, Julia." He said it softly. Hairs rose on her arms. "No." No. Why did it hurt so much? What did Brisca have that she did not? "I suppose you don't wish to share my bed after all." That is not what I said. He was coming toward her now, a dangerous stillness about him even when in motion. He stopped before her, planting his hands on either side of her on the table, boxing her in. "Correct me if I'm wrong," he said quietly, "but it's been my impression that you want this as much as I do." A hot, insistent throb began between her thighs. Julia felt herself lean forward, almost meeting him, close enough to kiss. Their breaths mingled, heated the air. She had the distinct feeling he was waiting for her to cross the final distance between them. To admit he was right. In her mind, she slid her hands up the corded strength of his arms, then greedily over his chest, feeling the hard ridges of muscle on his stomach, and the lines of his scars beneath her palms. In her mind, she ran her tongue along the seam of his lips, just a finger's length from her, pressed her mouth to the strong column of his throat, licked the scent of him off his skin. Oh, gods, she wanted to. The thought of him holding himself still like that fierce, disciplined stillness while she touched and licked him everywhere, made her weak with desire. Of course, she could never admit to the debilitating power he held over her. That would be a terrible mistake. "I don't want you." What a lie. She wanted to rub herself against him like a cat in heat. "I want to rule Rome in my brother's stead." More lies. She was lying through her teeth to a man who looked at her as if he could see down to the bottom of every lie she'd ever told. "If that is how you want it, I will not come to you again. In fact, I'm willing to predict it is you who'll come to me." A mocking grin lifted his lips. "I'll take you then, but only when you beg." "I'll never do that. In fact, I rather think it's you who'll beg before this week is out." His laugh sounded against her throat. The sweet, warm vibration of it made her toes curl. "We'll see who breaks first, then." And then, to her vast annoyance, he was gone.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.